My name's Harold Offeh. I'm an artist. I work with performance. My work particularly is interested in how the body can be used to explore the connections between historical narratives and contemporary culture.
Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Priyesh Mistry, Associate Curator for Modern and Contemporary Projects at the National Gallery, and I am pleased that you are with us for a slightly different format to our usual talks as part of our Unexpected View programme. As you may know, for these events, we would usually be in the National Gallery in front of a painting, but as we are not letting the pandemic hold us back, we are hosting the conversation online and are continuing to use this opportunity to explore some of the themes and ideas that are shared between a National Gallery painting and a significant artist working today. Before we begin, I would like to thank Hiscox for their support of this programme as the National Gallery's contemporary art partner. Now, as I'm sure you are all aware, this evening's invited artist is Harold Offeh, and we are going to be speaking about one of the most iconic paintings in the collection, Botticelli's Venus and Mars, a stunning 15th century painting from Florence that is currently hanging in our Sainsbury wing alongside other works by Botticelli in the collection. There is a wonderful film on the National Gallery's YouTube channel in which my colleague Caroline Campbell talks about the painting and its history. So we won't necessarily be repeating that talk today, but we will draw out on some of the themes and ideas of the painting through Harold's work. I'm personally so excited to be speaking with Harold today, having been an admirer of his work for many years now. Harold Offeh is an artist based in Cambridge and works across a range of media, including performance, video, photography, learning and social arts practice. Not only does this mean that he often produces artworks and performances in collaboration with different groups of people, but I would also consider his role as a teacher in this too. He is a visiting tutor at the Royal College of Art, Goldsmiths College and the Slade School of Art in London, and is also a reader in fine art at Leeds Beckett University, where he recently completed his PhD. Harold's work explores the space created by the embodiment of history through reenactment in various forms. Amongst many other accolades, Harold has exhibited widely, both in the UK and internationally, including at Tate, the South London Gallery, Cathood's Yard in Cambridge, the Studio Museum Harlem in New York, and the Art Tower Mito in Japan. For this evening's talk, we are also very lucky as Harold is reenacting a performance from his series Lounging while we hold the discussion. So welcome, Harold.
Hi, Priyesh. Hi, everyone.
So thank you for joining us. So to kick off the conversation, I wanted to ask you what drew you to Botticelli's Venus and Mars for this evening's talk?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me. And it's really great to be here and speaking to everyone. And thanks for everyone for joining us. I also want to thank you just really for facilitating a really interesting conversation really around works in the collection and a conversation that we both had about thinking about works that might resonate with aspects of my practice. And through a lot of my work, I'm really interested in performance and posing and how bodies are particularly figured or presented, perhaps in relation to the camera. Venus and Mars, I think, is this really amazing example of these two bodies that are posing and presented in this particular posture, which is something that I'm very invested in. So this idea of the kind of languorous, repose, reclining, and over the last few years, I've been particularly invested in this depiction of Black male singers in this kind of lounging repose. But it led me to really think about particularly the significance of this pose, particularly within the history of kind of European and Western art. And sort of Botticelli's painting obviously is this kind of canonical staple of, of European art.
I think that is really interesting that you touch on this, the kind of history of the kind of reclining pose in the Western tradition, and it's important or interesting to kind of note about Botticelli's depiction of this subject, you know, because it is fairly unique in the way that he's treating this kind of mythology of Venus and Mars, something that is quite well known, you know, within kind of society, but also back then it was kind of a common story, and we'll touch on that a little bit later on, I hope. But in this kind of, in the way that he has presented Mars in particular, in this sort of, as a sort of male nude reclining, it wasn't necessarily a common way of depicting Mars, but also other figures around that time. You know, the male nude was very common within Christian iconography. But actually what he was doing was taking a lot from kind of classical sculpture, from ancient Romans and ancient Greek sculpture of at that time. And I wanted to kind of explore that a little bit further, because I think what drew us particularly to this painting, you know, not only because of this male figure reclining and actually him being in this kind of quite vulnerable position, you know, being depicted as sort of semi-nude while Venus is clothed, and the sort of the allegory of love conquering war after, you know, because this is a portrait of the two figures after they've had intercourse. So it's this idea that love will always conquer war in any sort of any scenario. But this idea of the reclining figure is something that I think you've taken on board, in particularly in this series Lounging, which you're kind of performing now, in from a sort of slightly different perspective in a way. So you've taken it from these album covers, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. And while we're talking, there's also a sort of video of previous sort of iterations, because you also re-perform these figures and these postures in different ways. So perhaps we can see also some of the videos of you kind of reenacting this in different locations.
Yeah, I mean, the origins really of the Lounging project sort of comes from, I think, an ongoing inquiry into looking at depictions of Black figures in through the album cover, and really thinking about an album cover as something that functions to market and represent and display the artist, you know, and to speak to the kind of the nature of the music. And I'd sort of noticed while I've been doing the project that there was this sort of trope of early 80s, early to mid 80s album covers of Black male singers who all seem to be in various kind of iterations of this kind of reclining repose. So I'm thinking, you know, very mainstream singers like Lionel Richie and Michael Jackson, Billy Ocean, Luther Vandross, it became really interested to read. I became just really interested and fascinated in why it was such a trend at that point, and what was at stake. What do they see in this particular pose that for me had a very kind of like art historical resonance, but for them in terms of marketing not only their music but themselves had a particular kind of resonance. And I mean, as often with a lot of my projects, I use kind of performance and the reenactment of images as a way of exploring, or as a starting point for really thinking about how a body might be configured and what's at stake within particular articulations. So for example, this pose that I'm doing now, which sort of has echoes of Mars in this weird leg over the one leg, sort of slightly weirdly over the reclining leg, has a particular resonance with, there's an album cover by the American singer Teddy Pendergrass, where his body is kind of composed in a very particular way, and he's doing this very particular kind of gesture. And for me, the initial starting point is actually to, what happens if I actually, reenact this pose, to explore the kind of mechanics of it. Because I think for me, again, there's this kind of whole resonance really about what the pose is conveying. Because, this idea of kind of like being horizontal, being languorous, being at leisure, in many ways is a sense of kind of conveying a sense of kind of power. There's that sense of being able to be, being free of labor and work, but just being able to kind of like hang out and to occupy space. And I think, for these singers, I think they were partly trying to kind of convey a sense of sophistication, to convey a sense of also sexuality, of power, and so for me, it's quite sort of kind of complex. But also at the same time, the pose is kind of like slightly debased. I'm sitting on the floor in a lot of the album cover images, although these like, huge singers and pop stars are kind of sort of lying around, they're lying on the floor. So in some senses, being on the floor is quite vulnerable. There's a sense of kind of like exposure that kind of goes with this pose. So, and for me, a lot of that has come about through this kind of repetition of performing this pose, and in these videos that are being screened, quite often I take the pose to kind of new locations and situations. So you see me in the video performing at Art Tower Mito, which is an amazing contemporary art center in Japan. Mito is a sort of medium-sized city about an hour north of Tokyo. And it's this amazing kind of sort of grandiose temple-like architecture. So I'm really interested in the idea of particularly Black figures occupying space in the landscape. So for me, each time I do this pose, really, it's about really thinking about how this pose can be transposed into these different locations, and how does it then kind of really activate the space, or how is it in conversation with the particular landscape or backdrop that it's set against.
I mean, this one in particular is extraordinary because you've got this rainbow happening in the background. It's almost like a sort of lo-fi version of something you might find on an album cover, this kind of fantastical sort of scene, and then, someone sort of like, reclining in the foreground. And actually that, this idea of sort of it being a sort of powerful pose, Botticelli showed him in this position actually to not show him in a position of power, but actually a position of vulnerability, because he's sort of, fast asleep. But there's also a sense of, a real sense of humor around the way that he's decided to depict this kind of powerful figure. So it's almost kind of subverting it on its head. And I guess in a way that's what you're trying to do with what you're doing with your performances by reenacting them. There's a certain humor in that as well. And in particular in this work, it's heightened by these putti, these figures, these satyrs who are just making so much racket and playing with his armor, really taking the mickey, I think. And I think that's an interesting connection to also think about humor in your work, and how that's used as a sort of strategy of your work to not only kind of access these histories or these kind of moments or these particular kind of ways of embodying kind of histories or styles in the past, but also as a way of sort of analyzing that moment and analyzing these postures or these positions. So, earlier works where you explored sort of tapping or the hairography, about these particular sort of tropes of certain communities, or kind of recreating kind of positions in other places as well. Can you talk to that a bit about how you kind of see humor playing out in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, humor is really quite important in terms of thinking about engaging audiences and how there are different forms of humor, obviously, and I think sometimes with this particular work, I'm thinking about that kind of slight absurdity, which becomes just a kind of disruption. And perhaps it's also about kind of attention seeking, but I often think about it in relation to what, the idea that I think often we have with art in encounter, and is what are the terms of the encounter? And I think humor often provides a kind of playfulness that allows people to kind of engage with the subject. And it's perhaps a means then to kind of go further and explore why things are perhaps strange or absurd, or why certain behaviors, or why certain images or postures or whatever are being kind of presented. So yeah, for me it's slightly about disarming or kind of engaging, definitely. I'm
You see this a lot in a performance that I really admire called or in a work called Selfie Choreography, which I find the kind of I think, I mean, if you could talk a little bit about that work, because in a way it sort of exemplifies the way that you would, you're kind of employing humor to kind of address a certain way of behaving.
Yeah. So yes, Selfie Choreography really emerged from a kind of workshop, and I was really thinking about what was at stake in self-image making, and obviously the selfie, and particularly the selfie stick, and the workshop, I should say, really centers around this slightly redundant, or less fashionable now anyway, device for self-imaging. And I really wanted to think about how there were certain kinds of performance and forms of self-presentation that went along with using a selfie stick and taking a selfie, and in how, just in observing people who would take images with selfie sticks, that there were certain types of expressions or gestures or poses that they would perform. And I thought this could be a really interesting basis for a workshop where you could kind of unpack and really start to kind of play with the potential of self-imaging, and perhaps sort of take it further in terms of thinking about different ways in which you might, use the object of the selfie stick to make images of yourself, but also yourself in relation to a particular context, in relation to a landscape or an architecture, or other bodies who might, kind of infiltrate the space. So really the work is kind of like, it is a workshop where I invite people, give them a selfie stick, and we go through a number of kind of short exercises where we try out different ways in which you might take images. And then hopefully it sort of spins out really, and it becomes a mechanism or a device for thinking about image making. But yeah, it's super playful and speculative.
I think that also allows us to connect back to the painting in a way, to also think about what the painting's purpose was. So Botticelli's Venus and Mars, I'll share another image of it hanging in our galleries. It's an unusual format. It's in this kind of rectangular form, and it was seen. It was actually, when we think about these paintings back in the 15th century, they weren't necessarily in frames hanging on a wall, but featured as part of the kind of paneling or the objects that you might find in a room. And we particularly think that this work was made for a room called the Camera, and it's sort of not quite a bedroom space, but certainly a space where people slept, but also a space where they would entertain guests. And you would have all sorts of imagery, sort of both sort of mythological figures, but also religious imagery, or embedded into the kind of the decor of this space. And it was seen as a space where you actually were able to kind of entertain and have conversations with your guests. And a work like this probably would have been commissioned for a wedding or a new marriage, but also because of the kind of narrative, this popular narrative of Venus Mars and the history of it, and the kind of popular nature of it, and also the humor that's kind of in the work. It would have been one that would have been commissioned as a conversation starter as well. It would have been there in order to kind of provoke discussion, and this got me to think about how in your work you're not necessarily there answering questions or kind of putting a solution to an issue out there. When you're exploring these album covers or these postures and reenacting them, more as a ways of exploring some of those ideas. But also in the way that you also collaborate with other people. I think that's a really interesting aspect of the way that you work, in particular as an artist. You're often facilitating workshops or working with a group of people to explore certain ideas. We talked a little about Selfie Choreography, but I wonder if you could talk about and perhaps another project in which you've invited other people to participate. I mean, the lounging series was interesting in one iteration of the project where you photographed other people posing in this reclining pose.
Yeah. So working with a good friend of mine, an artist, Eloise Calandra, we were invited to do a sort of pop-up performance workshop at Tate Modern as part of one of the later Tates, which was in connection with the Soul of a Nation exhibition that was happening at that time, I think 2017, if I'm correct.
A show that I curated. That's great.
It was an amazing show, and definitely recommend people to check it out. And there's an amazing catalogue as well to kind of go with that show. Yeah, Eloise and I staged a sort of pop-up studio where we invited audiences to re-perform one of 3 album cover images, and this Teddy Pendergrass pose, reclining lounging pose, was one of them. And I think we were slightly underestimated, like the popularity of like a later Tate event, because we had like 350 people come through and sort of queue up, and many of them actually chose to do the lounging pose. And I think I was particularly really interested in just, again, the idea of how people embodying an image, and many people embodying the same image, and really thinking about the articulation of that. That sort of kind of constitutes an archive, but one of the things that I think is really interesting about reenactment or reperformance is that I think it's easy to dismiss as kind of like empty kind of parody, or but it's interesting for me how it's really embedded within contemporary culture. You see it in platforms like TikTok or YouTube or Instagram, that people are reenacting or reperforming sort of source material from popular culture or other references. But for me, it is really interesting is that process of examining the original material and then the transposition and translation into a different context, because the copy is never the same, but there is a process there's a critical inquiry, I think, that happens when somebody chooses to invest time in trying to reenact and reperform something. And I think that's just important to kind of sort of acknowledge. So yeah, in that tape, well, it was really interesting to really see people looking at the images and reconfiguring their bodies in relation to this original image. And also just people having really interesting discussions and questioning the source material, like, if they didn't know who Teddy Pendergrass was, who is he? What's the context of that image being made? So for me, a lot of the times, the kind of reenactment is also, it's a kind of annotation, or it's an arrow that links, I think, the present with this historical moment and the context of that historical moment.
Yes, and I guess it's also interesting thinking back about throughout art history and how certain figures and certain stories are then retold or reimagined, and that's what's something quite unusual about this work, Venus and Mars, and in that it's unusual in the way that it's depicting this mythology and this narrative. Usually, in sort of other depictions of Venus and Mars, you see Mars as this kind of very heroic figure, dressed in his armor, and it's usually Venus who's completely nude. Whereas this work, the roles are kind of reversed, where Mars is, is semi-nude and kind of reclining, and actually it's Venus who's holding her kind of presence. She's kind of she's sort of almost kind of non-interested in Mars anymore. She's kind of looking elsewhere and is holding her posture, even though actually when we think about it, holding those postures as you've described before is actually quite a difficult thing to do for, they're not comfortable necessarily positions to hold, especially when you've got your leg crossed over onto the front. Yeah, exactly. So it's interesting that we kind of thinking about how those sort of mythologies are translated and how they're sort of embodied. So, how a painter like Botticelli sort of uses the human figure to embody these narratives as well. Just to just briefly before we end, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you have done that recently in your project in Croydon, and how you're using the kind of histories of Croydon and sort of trying to find different ways of sort of embodying them or presenting them so that other people can, visitors and audiences or participants in workshops can kind of interact with them.
Yeah, I mean, 2019, I worked with Turf Projects, which is an artist-run gallery based in Croydon at the Whitgift Shopping Centre, and the project involved responding to the Museum of Croydon, which is like an amazing municipal council-run museum in the centre of the borough, and for me that was really interesting to kind of engage with these objects, historical objects, but for me it felt important, I think, to also be in conversation with, I think, people who, actively living and working in Croydon, and Turf Projects facilitated me working with students from Croydon School of Art, and we held a number of kind of like sort of workshops and sessions where I had this kind of revolving turntable, which was, the gallery Turf Projects is literally an ex-shop unit, so an ex-retail unit with a big window that looks out over lots of passers-by, passing shoppers, and I was really interested in this idea of, again, sort of posing and postures. So we had this session where I was inviting students and young artists to really think about how they might pose and present to this audience within the shopping centre who would be looking in through the window. And so for me, this was a way of kind of like, again, speaking to not only the kind of historical narratives through the objects that were represented within the exhibition, but also a way of kind of presenting these kind of narratives, but also figures of contemporary young people who are living and working in Croydon. And Croydon's incredibly, like, as I'm sure as people tuning in will know, is a really diverse area of London, with many layers of kind of histories. So yeah, I mean, and I think in a lot of my work, I'm really interested in like the intersection of like contemporary and historical narratives.
I think what's interesting about us speaking about the Botticelli today is that it was commissioned as a conversation piece, you know, very much as a work that you can look again and sort of enjoy on multiple occasions. And what's astonishing about it is that centuries later, we're still using it as a way to kind of trigger a conversation, and to use it as a way of kind of talking about your work today. So Howard, thank you so much for joining us this evening and for allowing us to explore your work through using the themes and the ideas from Botticelli's Venus and Mars, and perhaps also then allowing us, once we're back in the galleries again, to come and look at the work and see actually what's going on with Mars when he's reclining in this pose. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.